Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the virtual stage of the Lawrence Family JCC Jacobs Family Campus. Tonight's event is a presentation of JLearn and of the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture. My name is Ryan Isaac. I am the Director of Cultural Arts at the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture, and we are live from the guest room with Deborah Hertz tonight. We are well into our third month of virtual programming, and I see a lot of familiar faces. I also know we have a couple first-timers with us tonight, and I want to thank all of you for supporting us, for being with us, and for continuing to support us during this time. It's wonderful to have forged this bond and taken our community into this virtual space. You can get information about the rest of our virtual programs at lfjcc.org/about/virtual. I'd also like to take time to thank our underwriters, the underwriters of the 2019-2020 Arts and Ideas, JLearn, and Film Seasons. Thank you all very much. It is through the generosity of the underwriters that we are able to continue to program even during the temporary closure of our facility and of the Arts and Ideas and the Garfield Theater. Just a quick note about Zoom protocol. Many of you seem to know what you're doing by now, which is great. It's terrific to also see so many faces. So many videos are on. It's nice to see you all. Don't forget that you all can be seen as well. Tonight, we are joined by Deborah Hertz. It's wonderful to have Deborah with us. Deborah is the Herman Wouk Chair in Modern Jewish Studies and a professor in the Department of History at UC San Diego. Tonight, she's going to speak to us about Jewish radical women and how they turned violent, particularly around the early 1900s. She is a St. Paul native, graduated summa cum laude from the University of Minnesota, and also received her PhD in German history from the University of Minnesota. Go Gophers. In 2008, she founded the Holocaust Living Workshop, which is a collaboration between the UCSD Jewish Studies program and the library. It is designed to preserve the memory of victims and survivors of the Holocaust. Deborah, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Welcome. How are you doing?
How am I doing? I'm sitting in my grandchildren's bedroom. I'm trying not to show the bed. I don't have that San Diego beach scene behind me because I'm not on the beach. So this is the new reality, right? We're all so intimate and we're so far, but we're so close. It's a pleasure.
You told me you're on sabbatical right now. Is that correct?
I'm on something called zero teaching quarters. So every day I have 10 hours a day to do footnotes and track down everything. And I keep pestering my friend Eric Mitchell, the director of the library, with various requests like, couldn't you just hand my interlibrary loan books to me through a window, please? They've been sitting there since March 10th. And he keeps telling me, calm down, calm down. You can fill that footnote in later. We'll open up eventually. So yeah, the library is an important place for historians.
You've been spending a lot of this time footnoting. Is that correct?
I have a manuscript which is almost 300 pages. What I'm giving you tonight is, just the kind of exciting highlights that I thought you would appreciate. So yeah, I'm just tracking down. When Hadaam's daughter decided in 1890 to convert, why didn't he speak to her? And I keep finding more and more, Jewish radical women that are hiding. So that's what I do all day.
That's terrific. And when are you scheduled to return to the classroom?
Well, UCSD is on something called Return to Learn in the fall quarter, which is going to be like a mix-up of, large classes being remote, small classes being in person. But I'm not back in the classroom till January of 21. And if we're not real in January of 21, the world will obviously have ended, because I cannot imagine, remote going on and on and on. But I've been wrong before.
That's right. We might have you back here in January just to prove that the world is still spinning.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to get into the presentation? Should we?
Yeah. Can we put the slideshow up?
Pardon me?
Can we put the slideshow up?
Yes. Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to preface anything before.
No, we can go right into the slideshow.
Okay.
So I'll just say that I'm timed to give you about 20 minutes to a half hour of material. The title of the talk is the same title as my book, Visionaries, Lovers, and Mothers, Jewish radical women from conspiracy to kibbutz. So it's a pleasure to be here on Zoom. We who are historians are very eager to escape the present and move into the past, which is what I do every day. But I don't think it's simply a diversion. I actually believe that as historians that we can learn and teach about both the successes and the failures of past generations, and even maybe query the whole question of what is past and what is success. So let's go to the next slide. It should be Naomi Shepherd. There, okay. So this book was born in an auto repair shop in Haifa in the spring of 1995. I was teaching at the University of Haifa. I was having my little VW Bug repaired. I was deep into my second monograph, which was a book about conversion and assimilation in Berlin. And I was teaching this book, Jewish Men as Rebels and Radicals. Now, at the time, I was a little bit scornful of the book. A friend of mine was gossiping to me and said, how could Harvard University publish this book? It's full of errors. It has all of these problems. But the students at the University of Haifa were ecstatic about the book. And every day they brought to me piles of and pictures of women in the history of Zionism that I needed to pay attention to. And at the time, we were living on a kibbutz. Next slide, please. So this was the kibbutz we lived in, Ramat HaShofet, and I would bring my kids to the children's center early in the morning. And I was extremely interested in the roots of the kibbutz, and I wanted to understand the deep historical genealogy of how Jewish history had ended up with a utopian, I would say feminist, you might say socialist form of living. So as that day, as I sat in the auto shop and I was preparing my class on Naomi Shepherd, I realized I had a book here. It was the same topic as Naomi Shepherd's, but what I wanted to do was to make it real history. So instead of 8 potted biographies of radical women, I wanted to write an entire history of the left and of Zionism that would integrate these amazing personalities into a wider frame. Now, at the time that I made this decision, I was completely fed up with the women that I had been researching for 25, 30 years. I got very tired of their hypocrisies, their social obsequiousness, their desire to assimilate, their abandonment of Judaism, and I was really ready for a radical change. So for the last 12 years, I've been immersed in these women, and it has been a tremendous joy to be with them. They're inspiring. Sometimes they get me very angry, but I'm very engaged with them. So in tonight's talk, I want to focus on 3 of them. And before I start in with the first one, his name was Gangsta Gelfling, I want to say a couple of words about the words in my title: visionaries, lovers, and mothers. So let me begin with the word visionaries. I never pretend, and I have been a bit disappointed, but it is the truth, that these women did not chart the policy or the strategies of either the left or Zionism in their time period. Unlike the male radicals who were always arguing over minor points, and then they would walk off in a huff and start their own political party, these women were not ideologists. Mensheviks would be Mensheviks, Bolsheviks would be Bolsheviks, Zionists would be Zionists without any women's participation. But, however, they made a tremendous service both to themselves and to the wider movements because they symbolized sensitivity, they symbolized morality, they gave this presentation of permanence to the left-wing cause. I'm also convinced over and over again that the radical women grew as individuals through their political activity. They learned languages, they undertook daring tasks, they earned their own living, and they, above all, mastered tremendous, tremendous adversity. As for lovers, well, I choose that word because of the very irregular way that they formed their romantic relationships. So I don't choose wives because they rarely were legal wives. Those Jewish women who fell in love with Christian men did not convert and intermarry, and there was no civil marriage in this time period. this was a way, the left was an arena for assimilation. That's what I learned was kind of a link between both of my books. So even though they were poor, even though they were never taught Russian, even though they didn't have tutors, even though they didn't have beautiful libraries like the aristocratic women who became radicals, they kind of scratched a life for themselves through these movements. Now, let me talk a little bit about Jewish women radicals as mothers. This is a vexed point, and for years of teaching women in the Nazi period, I've been highly aware, as I'm sure you're all aware, that the right has always sort of captured motherhood as its cause. And I became extremely interested in the idea of how being on the left affected one's chances of being mothers. Now, as you're going to see with the first case I'm going to look at, Gangsta Gelfling, the radical women in the period of the 1870s and 1880s, this is now, we're like 40 years before the First World War, they often either didn't have children, gave their children to relatives to raise, children died in prison. It was a very bitter, very difficult, very painful a part of their lives. And I'm still extremely fascinated with the question of whether the left can be considered to be an antinatalist social movement. But now, those of you who are thinking that I'm going to present to you Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman, perhaps the two most famous women of this era, no. I'm going to give you three women that you probably have never heard of. First, Gangsta Gelfling, then Pua Rakovsky, and third, Manya Shoka. So let's go into the next slide. Okay, so this is Gangsta Gelfling. On March 1st of 1881, a small band of radicals, including several Jewish activists, assassinated the Czar of Russia. Gangsta Gelfling was then 26. She supervised the safe house where the dynamite bombs were being hidden. And if you go to the next slide, which should show the assassination of the Czar. Yes, the assassination of the Czar was a turning point in Russian history, a turning point in Jewish history, and for sure was a turning point in Gangsta Gelfling's life. After the assassination, a wave of violent pogroms erupted. Over 200 Jewish communities suffered from rape, pillage, aggressive violence. Now, the Jewish activists were in the eye of the storm because it was very convenient to blame the assassination on the Jewish activists. There was an article in a contemporary Russian journal, "What dark force drove the Jewish youth to become revolutionaries?" There was a tale circulating that the new Tsar, Alexander III, had ordered Christians to harm Jews as a revenge for Jewish participation in the assassination of his grandfather. So I became very interested in the idea that Gangsta Gelfling was a character, a protagonist in Jewish history by participating in this bomb plot. But after the pogroms, you have the massive immigration to the United States. You have a trickle of immigrants coming to Palestine. It's a dividing point. So she has, as they're going to suggest to you, very low Jewish identity, but very high Jewish impact. So let me just trace a little bit about her life. Let's go into the next slide, see what I've got here. Next slide. I'm not in power of, there we go. So there's Gangsta Gelfling on the stand at the trial after the assassination. She's right there in the middle with her hair up. So her father was a well-to-do wood seller, a seller of timber. He tried when she was 16 to force her to marry someone that she didn't like, and she ran away. Now, I've done some research on her languages. She was, of course, born speaking Yiddish, but she taught herself both Russian and she knew actually some Hebrew. She runs away, moves to Kiev, tries to become a midwife, works as a seamstress, and found all the radicals. A whole lot of different Jewish other radicals found her, and she became recruited. She is on trial in 1877. She goes to the workhouse. Then she's sent in a convoy of prisoners to an obscure place. She gets a false passport. She escapes, and then she returns to St. Petersburg to join the radical movement. At this point, they don't want women like Gangsta. They don't want Jews to be in the forefront of radical activity. So she's assigned to manage the safe house. So after the assassination, the police raided the apartment where she was living with her fictitious husband. Her real lover was an aristocratic man named Kolatkevich. And it turns out during this trial that she's pregnant. And you cannot kill a pregnant woman according to Russian law. So her other comrades, can I have the next slide? Yeah. The women who were involved in the assassination plot, and the men too, became extremely famous. They were posters of them everywhere. They were martyr heroines. There were a lot of trials at the time for other radical acts of assassination. But meanwhile, Gessia, who we see up here, is in prison. The father of her baby is also in prison. He dies somewhat later. She has a baby in prison. The baby gets taken away from her. The baby dies, and then she dies a few days later. So at this time period, the 1870s and the 1880s, and for most of the 1890s, there were no all Jewish socialist parties. All Jews who became radicals went into these major movements. So we're going to turn now to a period in around the year 1900, after Gessia has been in her, wherever her grave is, for quite some time, almost 20 years, and look at two women who did try to integrate socialism and feminism to some degree into their Jewish identity. So the first woman we're going to look at in this period is Pua Rakovsky. Next slide. Okay. Her life story shows how incredibly difficult it was for a very spunky, very ambitious, very talented, very dedicated educator of young girls in Hebrew and an ardent Zionist to find a way to serve this cause. She has a fantastic memoir, and in her memoir, she talks about the stray spark of the ancient matriarchy, which she feels she has somehow lost because she, unlike Gangsta Gelfling, she succumbs to an arranged marriage. She hates her husband. Her parents have forced her into this marriage, and she's agreed. She has 2 children by the time she's 20, and she wants to be a midwife. She wants to go to gymnasium. Parents say no to everything. And finally, she detested her husband, and she moves away to live with her grandparents and study to be a teacher. She gets passes her exam, and the Zionist movement in Odessa hired her in Warsaw to start the first primary school to teach Hebrew to young girls, which is her calling. And let's just go forward a couple of slides. Okay, so there's her book, and here she is at an older age, a wonderful, wonderful picture. So all through her life, from the time she becomes liberated from this marriage, she's a very warm mother. One of her sons becomes a communist, moves to the Soviet Union. She goes for a year to the Yishuv in Palestine to start vocational schools for girls. Back in Warsaw, she starts summer camps, vocational education. One of the funniest, interesting tidbits about her life is that she made her living as a translator when she couldn't be supported by her schools, and she translated Trotsky's memoir. Must have been from Yiddish, from Russian into Yiddish. The Soviet Union cuts her off, and she never gets to see her son. In 1935, she makes her aliyah to Palestine and lives there for 20 years until she dies in 1989. Okay, now our final woman. Next slide. The woman I'm going to talk about last is named Manya Shoka, a spectacular, actually a shocking figure on the Zionist left. Now, what's important to understand about her life, here you see her in the corner of this slide, and let's get one more slide of her. Yeah, this didn't come out very good. The more I tried to expand it, the grainier they got. This is the Vilbushevitz family. She's sitting in the front on our right with her hair up. Was an enormously large, fairly well-to-do family. The father was extremely assimilated, and the mother was a maskila. The mother was a business wife. That means the mother ran the mill that they leased, and the mother was a very powerful person, and a lot of her family members have extremely interesting lives, and you'll see, as what I'm going to tell you, how the sibling relationships proved extremely important in her lifetime. Now, she came of age at a time when Herzl's Zionism was completely unattractive to the Jews of Poland and Russia. The Jews of Poland and Russia had been Zionists already for decades before Theodor Herzl woke up and saw what was going on. But he wanted to bribe, he wanted to use his wife's dowry to pay the Sultan to get permission for the Jews to live in Palestine. He wanted the German Kaiser to sponsor settlements. He was all about power and influence and money. And these people were about social movements. So in the time of Manya Shoka, you see a very strong emergence of a wonderful political party. Some of you may have had grandparents or great-grandparents who were in it. It was called Poale Zion, the Workers of Zion. And this was the party that Manya Shoka affiliated with. Next slide, please. So here we see her in her, Russian revolutionary outfit, her little Russian granny glasses, and her very ardent look. So let's just recap a little bit about Manya Shoka's early life. She had been a Bundist, which meant she was a Yiddishist socialist, but she disagreed with the Bund on the issue of organizing the Jewish workers for economic goals and being a revolutionary who would be involved in assassinations. And while she was in prison for having a little study group. Her study group was attracting poor Jews, and she had a peddler woman who sold cakes to the participants. The study group was one of the main ways that Jewish women learned Russian, read the classical texts, and became radicalized. So Manya Shoka, Manya Vilbashevitz, is put in prison. While she's in prison, she makes friends with Zubatov, who's organizing a state union. It's very complicated to understand. I could go into it in the questions. If you really love the weeds of the Jewish left, you'll find this interesting. Otherwise, you might find it a little bit boring. But she starts a political party with the sponsorship of the head of the prison. Well, the other activists don't like her very well for this. And for years to come in her life in Palestine, she's hounded by people who think that she sold out to the Russian government. She then gets involved, after she comes out of prison, she gets involved in a plot to assassinate von Pleve. And this is a very interesting assassination project because he was hated both for his role, or his purported role, in the pogroms of 1903. So he's hated as an anti-Semite, and he's also hated because of his persecution for radicals. So she's all involved in this plot. She goes to Berlin to raise money for digging a tunnel, and while she's in Berlin, one of her Vilbashevitz brothers, they seem to show up everywhere, finds out from his contacts in Russia that she's about to be arrested if she goes back to Russia. So next slide, please. So he sends her a telegram in Berlin, or he's in Berlin with her, and he gets Nahum, who's another Vilbashevitz brother who's already living in Palestine, starting the Shemen oil works. And Nahum sends Manya a telegram that says, "I'm dying, come immediately." So that telegram was received in, I think, December of '03, and she gets on the boat in, I believe it's in Odessa to Constantinople to Jaffa. She gets off the boat. She's not a Zionist. She's a radical Bundist leftist. And here is an amazing picture of her. I'm thinking of it as a book cover. She's wearing her short hair, her Russian revolutionary costume. And she's arrived at Rishon LeZion, where her sisters-in-law are all living. One of her brothers has married a Feinberg daughter, and these women that you see here are dressed in the Victorian ladies' beautiful costumes of the first Aliyah. The first Aliyah was not kibbutz, was not working in the fields. These were supported by Edmund de Rothschild, and they were leading the lives of plantation owners with Arab labor. And this was the life that Manya Shoka entered. She soon is organizing her way into the early kibbutz and the beginning of the Haganah and the Israel Defense Force. Next slide. So I wondered whether it was the right thing to do to put the word unfaithful into the title of this slide. She married Israel Shokat, who had just come from radical organizing of Jewish self-defense in Grodno. Actually, he has a brother named Eli Shokat, who marries one of her good friends, and they form two rival political parties. And this is the time when Hashomer is beginning. They want to defend the kibbutzim that are just beginning from theft, from Arab peasants who felt that the land was still theirs just because their landlord had sold it. They didn't think that they should be leaving. It was a time when you have leftists who are very eager to show how tough they are. They're kind of in love with the Bedouin style. And if you look at the pictures from this time, they're often dressed as Bedouins. I call them in one chapter the Hebrew Bedouins and the muscular Eves. And Israel Shokat and Manya Shoka establish a kind of elite Jewish kibbutz family, which is quite interesting. David Ben-Gurion, for instance, was obsessed with them and was jealous of them because they didn't pay him any heat because he was a little schlemiel worker on the Sierra training farm. What I want to stress here before I move into the conclusion is that Manya Shokat and Israel Shokat had two children. The children were always sort of stashed on the kibbutz, Kfar Giladi, while the parents were devoted to the Labor Party, to the Hashomer, to the Haganah. Manya's specialty was going abroad to try to raise money for illegal guns, and they were constantly away. So I see this as a kind of a transition point where the values of the radical left were still very much in play, in which, you know, radical women were not craving motherhood, but the establishment of the kibbutzim was definitely designed to solve the problem that the left had been vexed with, which was how to have a left-wing family. And we see in the memoirs of the founders of the kibbutzim, Degania Aleph, the first kibbutzim, a new Hebrew family for a productive wife and a productive mother, which was a huge step forward, but in reality, they were still, I would say, trapped in a dichotomy between being radicals and being mothers. Let's look at the next slide. Yeah, so there was recently a play that opened in Jerusalem. I would have given anything to get on a plane and go. And it was based on this gun. This gun was owned by Manya Shokat's very best friend, Rachel Yanait Ben Zvi, who was a trailblazing labor Zionist. And many of the women at the time had guns. And it was considered absolutely normative to ride a horse and, you know, shoot whoever needed to be shot. And this was a period in their lives which, by the time it was the 1960s and you have the foundation of the State of Israel, you know, they're all in their 70s, and this is long past them, but it's a very important part of the history of Zionism. So let's move to the conclusion slides. Okay, so the Haskalah, which was the Jewish reform movement to revive Hebrew, to encourage Jews to have a modern education, they didn't help the Jewish women very much, because what they wanted to do was to really get rid of the business wife. They didn't want women in the market. They didn't want women screaming and selling and peddling. They wanted nice, proper wives. So the Haskalah is a very ambivalent, shall we say, cause of Jewish women's radicalization. So without having entrance to the university, without having wealthy parents, without being able to go to gymnasium, these women constantly were educating themselves, especially learning Russian, because you could not participate in the left without knowing Russian. But then they get on boats, then they go to the United States, they go to New York, they go to Palestine, and they really are very committed to the idea that they should have a family life, they should be intellectuals, they should make history. And even when they failed, they did a lot. Okay, a couple more conclusion slides. So if we want to see what do we have to thank them for? Well, if you believe that the Russian Revolution in 1917 was a huge step forward for humankind, even though you could say that it didn't end particularly well. I don't know how this lecture would go over if I was in St. Petersburg today, but without a doubt, the radical Jewish women and the radical Jewish men play a huge, huge role in the revolutionary movement. And I would add, that's not because they sympathized with peasants and workers because they had suffered. No, it's because the left was their means of getting out of their situation. You could say it was more selfish than it was empathic. Secondly, the kibbutz was a huge step forward. However, there was a cost to be paid. And I've often contrasted, as I do the picture research for my book, what they look like when they're Manya Shoka's age with, their militant haircuts and their hats and their long revolutionary dresses that they wore. And then what they looked like when they were in their 70s. There's a story of a kibbutz woman, or a woman who arrives to make aliyah and live on a kibbutz, and she looks around at the other women. She sees that their skin looks like leather. She spends the whole night crying. She gets up in the morning, picks up her hoe and goes to work. So they lost the protection of bourgeois marriage. And as Manya Shoka's life shows, that was a big thing to lose, because the kibbutz offered the men and some of the women a lot of chances for, what we might call a liberated sexual life. But a liberated sexual life when you're 15 is very different than a liberated sexual life when you have children and you're an older woman. So it was a trade-off. It was a trade-off. They didn't know what they were giving up, and by the time it was clear what they had given up, it was too late. Next slide. So if we want to look to the New York City version of this, after the Triangle Shirtwaist fire in 1911, we can see that the script for what's going on in New York City is, and across the country in terms of women and the textile industry, is that the politics that they brought on the boat with them go into high gear once they get to New York, because they're still poor and their fathers are sending them out to work. And when they're out to work, they're going to organize. And so I would say the AFL-CIO, the Amalgamated Women's Garment Workers, the housing in New York City that was built by the unions, I would say that's a direct heritage of Jewish women's activism. And I believe I'm at the final slide now. So I want to remind you that the heritage of the assertive, practicable, outspoken Jewish woman was not attractive in the 50s. It was not attractive after the war. And if you read Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and what it is they hate about Jewish women, why it is they must marry blonde women who are not Jewish, it's really because of the business wife role and the radicalism that I would say was made possible by the business wife role. So I'm writing my book to perpetuate their memory and to realize that these women not only faded into obscurity because the left faded into obscurity, they also faded into obscurity because they were actively hated by the great Jewish authors. And the great Jewish authors, as you all well know, often have a tremendous influence. So that's it, and I'd be happy to take questions. I think we can get rid of the slideshow. Oh, I was going to finish with a poem. Sorry, I'm not quite done, but I don't need the slideshow. So I just want to read you a poem, and it's a poem that was called At the Threshold, and it was written by Ivan Turgenev, and it was written in the 1870s, but it was samizdat, completely unpublished, but was read at every funeral of a radical and was only published much later in the 1830s, I believe. Okay, so I'll just read the poem. I see a large building. In the front wall, there is a narrow door, wide open. Behind the door, there is just darkness. In front of the high threshold stands a young girl, an ordinary Russian girl. The impenetrable gloom behind the door yields bitter coldness, and from the depths of the building comes the sound of a slow, deliberate voice. You, who wishes to step over this threshold, do you know what awaits you? I know, answers the girl. Cold, hunger, hatred, derision, contempt, abuse, prison, sickness, maybe even death. I know. Complete alienation, loneliness. I know. I am ready. I shall endure all sufferings, all blows, and not from your enemies alone, but from your family and friends. Yes, even from them. Good. Are you ready to sacrifice yourself? Yes. As a nameless sacrifice, you will perish, and no one will even know whose memory they should honor. I need neither gratitude nor any pity. I do not need a name. Are you ready to commit a crime? The girl lowered her head. Yes, I am ready to commit a crime. The voices do not immediately resume the questions. Do you understand, it finally asked, that you may become disillusioned in what you believe now, perhaps realize that you made a mistake and that you ruined your young life? I know that too, and I still want to enter. Then enter. The girl stepped over the threshold and a heavy curtain fell behind her. Fool, someone said from behind. Saint, someone responded. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That was wonderful. And I just wanted to ask you in terms of perpetuating the memory of these women, and you said early on when we first started chatting that sometimes these women anger you. I'm curious as to what you find in your research that elicits such emotion from you.
As anybody knows me, I have random emotions about things I should forget about. But yeah, I'm angry at the ones who don't seem to care that they might be playing a role in even though it's not fair, that the pogromists reacted to the participation in the conspiracy to assassinate the Czar with anti-Semitism. So I kind of want to chat with them about that. Like, did you know that would happen? Did you fear that would happen? That gets me very upset. Then I want to talk to them a lot about the men that they tie themselves to. They're very dashing romances, and you know, I'm very sympathetic to women who don't want to marry the man that their father tells them they should marry. So I'm sympathetic to them, but then I'm overwhelmed with what they gave up. You know, would you rather be the mother of 10 in a shtetl with Ava Shabbat candles? You'd be poor, you'd be provincial, but you'd have integrity of the culture that you were participating in. And they just fled that. And it isn't really, that's why I'm much happier with the kibbutz women, because they're secular, but they want to stay Jewish. So then I get mad at them because I don't think they're being nice enough to their Arab neighbors. I've got a lot of anger for everyone.
Well, I want to encourage anybody and everyone out there, if you have a question for Deborah, feel free to use the chat function within the Zoom. I did recently get one from Sal Kempinski. He asks you, Deborah, did Shochat's children become prominent figures in the Yishuv?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the son committed suicide. He was a paratrooper, and I don't know the circumstances of his suicide. The daughter is once interviewed by a Haaretz reporter, or maybe it was David Ben-Gurion, went to their kibbutz, which was called Kfar Giladi, and asks her about her childhood. And she said, well, I didn't really have parents. I'm really an orphan, which was shocking because her parents were at the time in their 50s. They died in their 70s. and there's been some weird reversals of religiosity. One of her descendants became a Baal Tshuva and is a prominent actor involved, who lives on what I call a settlement in occupied, whatever you call it, on a settlement. So there have been some bizarre reversals of fortune in that family.
Questions are rolling in right now. Deborah Pantoni asks about the business wife woman. Was she a radical, and what was her husband doing?
Yeah, the business wife was a role, and it is going on for centuries. I would say the business wife tradition must start not in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period. Maybe it starts around 1600. It's an Ashkenazi custom that has its roots in the supreme validation of male study. So if you want to stay in the yeshiva all day, that's fine, but somebody has to bring home the income. You could only live off your in-laws for so long. Typically, these couples would marry at 15 or 16. They would live as a kes, that would be the arrangement with the wife's family. It was a matriarchal, co-housing, extended family where her parents would support the family while they were probably too young to even bear children, but get busy with the reproduction project. And then if the husband was a genius, he could stay in the yeshiva. And if he stayed in the yeshiva, she could own a shop. She could be a peddler. She could lease. They often were living in sort of somewhat rural situations where they would lease taverns, lease grain mills, run boarding houses, and the business wife would speak whatever the local language was: Polish, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian. She needed a certain amount of mathematics. And we know from the study of names that they were considered often the head of the household because, as my brother and my brother-in-law, Randolph, who are here, know very well, when we went to Latvia to do our family history research, we were at the archive in Riga. They'll correct me if I get my memory wrong. And we came across all of these people who were called Ben Dvorah or Ben Sarah. And the naming practices reflect the power of the women. The dowry arrangements reflect the power of the woman. The Jewish woman was extremely well protected in marriage. She was very poorly protected in divorce, and she was very poorly served by the courtship system. But once she was married, she had a lot of privileges. And my argument for the book is that the business wife tradition made it normal. You travel alone, you speak Russian, you're used to mixing with non-Jews, and you're just a gutsy personality. So I believe there's a direct tie there.
All right, next question is from Frederick Hertz. He asks, where does Golda Meir fit into this narrative?
Yeah. And I saw that the new movie on Golda Meir is coming. Golda Meir is the recipient of all their organizing in Palestine. She gets her start when she arrives in Palestine. Don't check me on this Wikipedia while I'm talking. I don't like to guess these things. I would say after the First World War. I think maybe 1920. My book ends in 1914, but I have a few stray facts from after that. So she is moving up through the organization, the Israeli organization Na'amat, which is a women's labor party organization. And when she gets to the top of Na'amat, she throws the stepping stones, that she's used away and becomes a major figure in the Labor Party. And very much like Rosa Luxemburg, somewhat like Emma Goldman, I see these women as women. They don't see themselves that way. They see themselves as leftist, socialists, Labor Party apparatchiks. And actually, Golda Meir's life as a mother was difficult. Her husband hated the kibbutz, and I don't want to denigrate Golda Meir for any reason, because to have a Golda Meir to be the head of state was undoubtedly because of the role that women had played in the Zionist movement, undoubtedly. So it's a triumph, but it doesn't mean that it was easy for her to integrate all of those roles. And she was definitely not advocating for women's rights once she came into power. Thanks, Frank.
Our final question tonight, Deborah, comes from Ohuva Steinhaus, who recently saw 1913 and is wondering if the women had any more awareness about taking the land that they worked on, thinking that it is the start of current problems.
Yeah, I've wrestled with that a lot. I gave a paper at the Middle East Studies Association last December in which I was praising kibbutz women, and everyone else on the panel was completely silent because they thought these women were colonialists. I have a lot of struggle with that, and I would say that in order to understand that, we have to understand that the reason they did not want Arab labor was because they wanted an all-Jewish socialist society. They were followers of a completely nutty ideologue named Ber Borachov, who believed that all Jews should move to Palestine, and once they got there, they could have the class struggle. And the beginnings of the class struggle were to not exploit Arab workers. So there's something extremely tragic about the fact that they're trying not to exploit Arabs. And yet, in retrospect, the land that they're building these lovely utopian kibbutzim on, you know, it has been purchased. It's been totally legally purchased, but yet a medieval Arab landowning tradition in which the peasants were kind of like the animals that might stay on the land. And you had a modern European sense of what it meant to buy land in which you could clear it. And those two understandings of legal land purchase was a tragic encounter. And I don't have an easy answer. I wish I did.
Thank you, Deborah. You leave us all with that to consider and ponder as we go on. This was wonderful tonight. Thank you very much for sharing your research with us. It was great to come together with you, and I know you've been a longtime supporter of the film festival. Thank you for your involvement in that as well. Thanks to all the committee members who are here tonight and everybody else who came out. I hope you all enjoyed it. Our next event is next Tuesday, the 30th at 6 p.m. I'm going to try to do this and share this with everybody. With Sky Bergman. You remember her from a few film festivals past, and her film Lives Well Lived, and she'll be speaking to us about some of her new projects and what she's been up to. So I hope you can join us for that. Again, Deborah, thank you very much. And,
okay, my pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.
Have a great evening. Stay well.
Okay, good night. Thank you.